rejects it, and the United States backs that rejection fully, not in words just, but in actions. Bush #2 has gone to new extremes in rejectionism. He's declared the illegal West Bank settlements they must remain part of Israel. That's in accord with the Clinton position expressed by his negotiator, Dennis Ross, who explained that what he called Israel's needs take precedence over Palestinian wants. That's Clinton. But the party line remains undisturbed. Facts don't matter. Bush, Rice, and the rest are yearning to realize Bush's vision of a Palestinian state somewhere, someplace, persisting in the noble endeavor of the longtime honest broker. What's happened in the past is, of course, rejectionism goes far beyond words. It includes settlement programs, the annexation wall closures, checkpoints, and so on. Settlements increased steadily right through the Oslo years, peaking actually in Clinton's last year, the year 2000, right before the Camp David Accords. And the story is now being repeated before our eyes. Shouldn't surprise us. So to take just one example, with the Annapolis Conference approaching, Israel has just confiscated more Arab land to build a bypass road from Palestinians, I'm quoting now, in order to push the Palestinian traffic between Bethlehem and Ramallah deep into the desert and effectively bar Palestinians from the central part of the West Bank. That's part of the so-called E1 project, which is designed to incorporate the town of Ma'ale Adumim within Israel and effectively to bisect the West Bank. With such policies, continuing to quote, with such policies enacted by the government, the famous Annapolis Conference is emptied of all meaning long before it convenes. This is quotes from the Israeli peace organization Gush Shalom. All of this is backed by the honest brokers in Washington and paid for by U.S. taxpayers, who incidentally overwhelmingly join the international consensus in opposition to their own government. But that's not what we're going to hear. Well, in fairness, it should be added that there is occasional public criticism of the settlement programs. So in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, there was a favorable review of a very important study which has just been translated into English, Lords of the Land, by Edith Zertal and Akiva Eldar, which bitterly condemns the U.S.-backed Israeli programs in the West Bank and the takeover of Israeli political life by their advocates. It's a strong and important book. The review, however, goes on with conventional fairy tales. Among them, it tells us that within the Green Line in Israel itself, Israel is what it calls a vibrant democracy in which non-Jews have equal rights, and unlike the West Bank, there are no Arab villages made inaccessible because their roads have been dug up by army bulldozers. Well, again, there's a fragment of truth in the description. So take, for example, the village Dar el-Hanun in the so-called triangle, Wadi Ara. It's older than the state of Israel, but it's one of the innumerable unrecognized villages in Israel. So it's true that there's no road dug up by bulldozers, and the reason is that there's no road. No road is permitted by the state authorities. No construction is permitted. No services are provided. That's not an unusual situation for Palestinian citizens, who are also effectively barred from over 90% of the land by a complex and intricate web of laws and administrative arrangements. Technically, that was overruled by the High Court 7 years ago, but as far as I can determine, only technically. And we may recall that in the United States, it took over a century for even formal implementation of the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing equal rights to all persons, and actual implementation of it is still remote, a century and a half later. Well, let's turn briefly to the important question, the most important question: what can we do about it? Here it's useful to think about the apartheid analogy, and it's useful to remember a little history. In 1963, the UN Security Council declared a voluntary arms embargo on South Africa that was extended to a mandatory embargo in 1977. And that was followed by economic sanctions and other measures, sometimes officials, countries, cities, towns, some organized by popular movements. Now, not all countries participated. In the United States, the U.S. Congress did impose sanctions over Reagan's veto, but U.S. trade with South Africa then increased by various evasions, along with concealed support for South African terrorist atrocities in Mozambique and Angola, which took a horrendous toll. It's about 1.5 million killed and over $60 billion in damage during the Reagan years of constructive engagement, according to a UN analysis. In 1988, the Reagan administration declared Mandela's African National Congress to be one of the world's most notorious terrorist groups. It's 1988, while it described Renamo in Mozambique merely as an indigenous insurgent group. That was after it had just killed about 100,000 people, according to the State Department, with, of course, U.S.-backed African support. Thatcher's record was similar, or maybe worse, but most of this was in secret. There was just too much popular opposition. And the popular opposition made a difference. There was a very significant anti-apartheid movement decades after the global decision at the Security Council to bring apartheid to an end. In 1965, boycotts and other measures would not have been effective. 20 years later, they were effective, but that was after the groundwork had been laid by activist, educational, and organizing efforts, including within the powerful states, which is what matters in an ugly world. Well, in the case of Israel-Palestine, the groundwork has not been laid. The quotes that I just gave are perfectly representative examples. You can fill them out in books. The kind of popular measures that were effective against apartheid by the late 1980s are not only ineffective in the case of Israel-Palestine today, but in fact sometimes backfire, harming the victims. We've seen that over and over. And it's going to continue until the organizing and educational efforts make real progress. It's not just the United States. The European Union is hardly different. So, for example, the European Union does not bar arms deliveries to Israel. It joined the United States in vicious punishment of Palestinians because they committed the grave crime of voting the wrong way in a free election. And there was very little internal protest in Europe. Populations support the international consensus, but they don't react when their governments undermine any hope for its realization. Well, in the coming weeks and the longer term, there's plenty of educational and organizational activity that will have to be carried out among an American population that happens to be largely receptive, though deluged with propaganda and deceit. And it's not going to be easy. It's never been easy. But much harder tasks have been accomplished with dedicated and persistent effort.
MIT professor Noam Chomsky speaking recently in Boston at a conference called The Apartheid Paradigm in Palestine, Israel, sponsored by the Palestinian Christian organization Sabeel. If you'd like a copy of today's show, you can go to our website at democracynow.org. The keynote speaker at the conference was the former South African Archbishop Desmond Tutu. He was an inspirational leader in the South African fight against apartheid, awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1984, today continuing to speak out around the globe for peace and justice. In 2006, the Israeli government blocked Tutu from leading a UN delegation into Gaza. He was investigating the killing of 19 Palestinians in Gaza. Tutu made headlines recently when the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota, canceled an invitation for him to speak at the school next spring. The president of the university, the Reverend Dennis Deese, revoked the invitation over Tutu's criticism of Israeli policy in the occupied territories. Deese also fired Chris Tofolo as head of the university's Peace and Justice program, though she remains a professor at the university. She had supported the invitation to Tutu. After a vocal public outcry from students and faculty, Deese apologized to Tutu and invited him back to speak at the university. Tutu began his speech at the historic Old South Church in Boston by addressing the issue.
As you probably know, someone put out a rather distorted version of what I said here in 2002, and on the basis of that, the president of St. Thomas University decided I shouldn't visit his campus. It is good that he has since reversed this decision, and I want to commend him very warmly for his courage in admitting publicly that he was wrong. It is never easy to do that. I have received the President's invitation in which he makes a very handsome apology, which I have accepted. And I am happy to accept his invitation, provided it can be fitted into my schedule, and if Professor Tofolo is reinstated with no adverse comments in her academic file arising from this unfortunate episode. I thank God for my Hebrew antecedents. I thank God that I too am a descendant of Abraham. I give thanks to God for the gift of the Holy Scriptures, made up substantially of the Hebrew Scriptures, forming what we conventionally refer to as our Old Testament. Even our New Testament, which would be distinctively Christian, is incomprehensible without taking its Jewish setting seriously. For instance, the name Jesus is Greek for Joshua, the one who led God's people into the promised land. And the word Christ is anointed one, in Hebrew, Messiah, whose coming was predicted in the Jewish scriptures and was longed for so poignantly by the Jews. I tell you nothing you do not already know. I refer to it only to assert that spiritually I am of Hebrew descent. That legacy has been of crucial importance for me in our struggle against apartheid. At the height of the struggle, when apartheid's repression was at its most vicious, and it seemed indeed as if the apartheid rulers were firmly ensconced in power, when they had all but knocked out the stuffing of their opponents, and they were strutting the stage as invincible cocks of the walk, then we turned to the inspiration of our Hebrew tradition and antecedents. We were able to revive and sustain our people's hope for their vindication and the ultimate triumph of good over evil, of freedom over injustice and oppression, by our references to our biblical traditions. It was often quite exhilarating. I remember once when there had been a massacre in one of our townships, which had been instigated by a sinister third force linked to the apartheid security apparatus, our bishops, quite unusually, suspended